Well, hello and welcome back to another time in the podcast studio here at ClueCon Weekly. And this week, I'm very excited to have Stefan Wintermeyer joining us all the way from Germany. Stefan?
Yes. Hi, David.
It's great to have you along. And I was just saying when we were talking, whenever I think of the name Stefan Wintermeyer, I think AMOOCon, which is a few years ago now.
It is. It's more than 10 years ago. Yeah, it's a long time ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was quite a fun time. We
Yeah.
had a couple of conferences, very VoIP heavy, but not just VoIP. And it was a great time. I never made any money with those, so that was the main reason why I stopped them. It was like a big money hole, but it
Yes.
was a lot of fun.
Yeah, fair enough. I know that Dr. Stephen Covey, the author of The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, he's one of his quotes is "No margin, no mission." If you're not making the money, you can't really achieve too much about it. And I would like to talk about those conferences before too long, Stefan. But I'd like to, in the first instance, go way back, even before those, because you ran those conferences because you got into the world of VoIP and open source communications. And I know things are different for you now, and I'd like to talk about that as well later on. But first of all, I'd like to step way back and ask how you came to get into the telecommunications, the VoIP, and the kind of open source world. So you and I are both considerably older now than when we first met, and so it's a way back question for you to start with.
Yeah, let me think about how I started with telephony. That was even before the internet or before my first web page. I remember I used to sell travel stuff, like a travel agency, and organized trips. And I wanted to give people the opportunity to today one would say download. Download was not a term then. To get prices, etc. And then I created a fax polling system where people like fax is not only sending, but it always also has this ability to poll information from another fax machine. So that was when I started with that. And then I created some sort of IVR system so that customers could call in and press buttons, or that was even with pulse at that time sometimes. And then they got some information, but that all became kind of obsolete because of the internet. So
just before we move on to the internet, so what sort of technology were you using for those early systems, Stefan?
In Germany, ISDN was very early popular. So most of the stuff I did with an ISDN card in an I think it probably was a 486 Pentium.
Right. And would that have been an Icon card or some other brand?
No, that was a German brand. I forgot the name. I'm not sure if that company exists anymore, but it was a German brand.
Right.
Again, ISDN was that was a very German thing at that time. I still remember that the ISDN cards from Digium had a long time problems with German ISDN, like driver-wise, but that's so long ago.
Yes, and we're talking about the 2-channel ISDN, aren't we? About the kind of basic rate thing. Back in the day. Okay, yes, sorry, I interrupted you. You said that all of that became obsolete when the internet came along.
Yeah, I invested kind of, I don't know how much I invested, but way too much money. And then like a year or two after that, I became aware of this thing called web pages. And then I thought, okay, that's like perfect for me. And I created my first web page, my first commercial web page, and sold diving trips, scuba diving trips, in mainly in Egypt, Red Sea area, over this web page, and that was the beginning of my career in all things internet.
Right. And were those trips that you were personally involved in, or were you more acting as an agent for these things?
No, I did plenty of traveling that time too. I went to strange places like I don't know, Yemen. I went twice to Papua New Guinea.
Goodness.
It's yeah. I didn't have family then, so
Right. It
different.
sounds like travel is in the Wintermeyer blood.
Yeah,
And
it is.
we'll come back to that later. Okay, yeah, please continue. It's fascinating.
So and yeah, and then that was a time when I switched from Windows to Linux too. So I started. My last Windows was Windows 3.11, and if I remember right, I used to code with Ball and Delphi or Delphi. How do you pronounce it in English?
Yeah, but Ball and Delphi, that was the C
Yeah, yeah.
compiler, wasn't it?
And I remember that Ball and Delphi had some API thingy, didn't call it API, to create web pages, to do some sort of CGI web page stuff. Very, very basic. But you could access the database and create some HTML pages. And I did that, and it became very obvious that this is very interesting, but Windows is not the platform to do it, at least at that time. Maybe today it's a different story, but at that time Windows was just that was out of its league. So I switched to Linux, and probably used Perl. I want to say Perl, to do my first web shops. Later on, I switched to PHP and then to Ruby, and today I'm using mainly Elixir with Phoenix or Ruby on Rails. Yeah.
Right. So still doing some programming in the
Yeah.
present day, Stefan.
Yeah, but
Okay.
the younger kids are becoming better and better. It's like the two of us, we are dinosaurs, and it's a hard business to be in our age.
Yeah, there are a lot of changes, and younger people seem adept at getting hold of those changes and running with them. So,
Yeah.
so it was travel that kind of drove your entry into telecommunications and then into the web. But where I know you from originally, Stefan, is the kind of the open source Asterisk world and things like that. So you had a web page up and running for your travel, and then how did you find your way back into the telecom side of things?
I stopped, or no, actually, I moved from travel industry to IT industry in 1998. I started working with SuSE Linux distribution, which was in those days for me like moving to Silicon Valley, but just in Germany. So that was a great step. And then I stayed with IT business from then on. I always used computer to do my stuff, but that was the first time when I started to make money with it. Yeah, and at one time, like we all I needed a PBX, and the old Asterisk story. Um, Somehow I saw Asterisk on the internet. I gave it a try. Um, I'm not 100% sure, but I think that I got personal support by Mark for some hardware issues in those days. Ordered the cards from the US, which was kind of a hassle in those days. Yeah, started with Asterisk.
So that it
Was
sounds like you were a very early adopter, because that would have been the very, very early 2000s, I guess.
Yeah. It was, and it wasn't cheap either. Those cards were kind of expensive, I remember. Yeah, it was like a new word, like to be able to create your own PBX and to actually program it. That was totally new, at least for me.
Yeah, and I guess, as you've already mentioned, ISDN. So although you'd got like a software PBX where you could define what happened in it, you still had to get the phone calls in over that traditional connectivity to start with.
Yeah, in the beginning, ISDN and analog and Digium, that was not a good fit at all, or match, or you know what I mean. A lot of problems for German users, and I guess I'm not sure. I haven't touched Asterisk for a very long time, but I guess still today there are no German voice prompts. Which is so funny because Digium made so much money from German customers, but all those years they were not able to create German voice prompts.
Right. Yes, I couldn't comment one way or the other because I've not looked in the right directories recently either. So were you were still working with Asterisk, I guess, when things started to transition into SIP, and of course there was a lot of SIP activity in Europe and in Germany with people like SIPgate being fairly early into that market.
Yeah, but you know what? The funny thing here is, and I don't know about the UK, but in Germany, it was for us the step from ISDN to ZIP was a downgrade, quality-wise. For the US, the step from crappy analog to ZIP was an upgrade, quality-wise. So I understood, or it took me quite a bit of time to understand why it was such a big hype in the US, but not in Germany. That was just because in Germany we had very good audio quality with ISDN.
Yes, we already had, A-Law and Mu-Law. Well, it'd be A-Law. Already had A-Law audio, didn't we?
Yeah, and all that, the first zip codecs and etc. with Asterisk, that was okay quality, but not nothing where people said in Germany, okay, that's just great, that's an upgrade. But
and of course, I think the other part of that story is that when the initial transition happened, we were transferring onto some very poor internet connectivity, weren't we? Certainly in the UK, it would have been ADSL. I know in Germany you would have been able to get internet connectivity on your ISDN. In the UK, we could not do that. So if you'd got ISDN and you wanted internet connectivity, the telecoms company would come and install just an analog line for you to have ADSL on it. You couldn't have the two together. And so, like you're saying, it was a bit of a downgrade in a certain way.
Yeah. And then at one time, I really don't know why. I totally forgot. I came to the very strange idea to create my own PBX with Asterisk as a base, and doing some PHP web GUI thingy around that, and that something for the German market, because all the US software, there was a couple of software from the US, but that all didn't fit to the German market. So, for example, we have a totally different extension system, which is not comparable with the US. I started that project, which was called Gemeinschaft, and that became quite big on the German market. But at the end, to fast forward, it was not fun business, because you install a PBX somewhere in a big company, and 9 out of 10 times people find stuff they don't like.
Right.
It's just from a personal perspective, people say, okay, the headset is too heavy or too light, or I don't know. It's my old phone had a nicer color, or I don't know. All these things, and I came into a mood where I just didn't want to work with zip anymore, whatever thing, but not zip, and not phone systems. And that was a couple of years ago. So I pretty much gave up on VoIP altogether, and that was
now Stefan, before we carry on, I do want to talk about the things that you're up to now, but of course you missed out a very colossal part of the story. And that is that, you started an early conference in Germany around VoIP and open source.
Yes.
things like that as well. So can we just jump back? Tell us, would that have been about 2006, 7, something like that, or I'm just trying to remember.
Sounds good. Maybe sounds good. People can search for AMOOCon on YouTube. With a bit of luck, you find old videos there. But the webpage is offline for probably 10 years now. I'm still paying the domain name, but that's a different story. Yeah, I wanted to do a conference, and from today's perspective, that was like most conferences today do the same thing, like recording everything on video, publishing everything on YouTube. But in those days, that was pretty new. For example, we had the problem that we had to cut each talk on YouTube because of the 10-minute limit. Today there's no 10-minute limit on YouTube, but in those days there was a limit. I think we did a very good job as a conference. It was for Germany a very good conference, for Europe too. But from today's perspective, today everybody does it. So
yeah, and tell me, Stefan, what was it that actually came to your mind and prompted you to start a conference? Because I guess you would probably have heard of Astricon at that stage, because I think Astricon started in 2004 from memory in Atlanta, and of course ClueCon, the Free Switch conference, had started in 2005, I believe.
Okay, I don't know if you really want to know my answer to that, but I'm giving it to you anyway. I don't like how traditional conferences set up their program, because at least 50% of talks are sponsored talks, and normally like 90% of those sponsored talks, they are boring. So that was one of the reasons where I said, okay, in my conference, people are not allowed to buy in for talks, and I want 2 talks from each speaker. One is like the business talk, which is the talk they give everywhere, and one I want to have a talk, something totally unrelated. And I'll never forget the one from the former CTO of GitHub, Scott, I forgot his last name, who talked about a trip to Rwanda to see gorillas. That was
Amazing.
Till today, that's my favorite talk, just because it was something totally different. Everybody in the audience was very, very technical, and then every speaker had to do a separate talk, which is out of comfort zone of most.
Yeah, that's a great idea, in that it allows people to kind of do what they think they would or they should be doing at such a conference, but it gives them kind of license to veer away and talk about something completely different as well. How did you relate the 2 talks? Were there 2 different tracks, or did one come straight after the other? How did it work?
It was one track conference, because I don't like the idea of multiple tracks, because every time you have multiple tracks, there's conflict where as an attendee, you think, okay, that's now a very bad situation, because I want to see both or all 3 tracks. So I said from the beginning, a 1-track talk conference, and maximum of 20 minutes per talk, because I believe that a good speaker can get all the information he needs to, or he or she needs to transmit within 20 minutes. And for a bad speaker, it's good for everybody if the talk ends after a maximum of 20 minutes. So that was today. I want to say it's nothing normal because of TED, but in those days I didn't know TED before when I created the conference, so that was a coincidence there. But I still like the 20-minute maximum talk length.
Yes, yeah, so it's single track conference. And when did you have like the technical talks in the morning and the non-technical in the afternoon? How did they interrelate?
I try to mix them up. Like I created the program myself, and I kind of thought, okay, after a technical talk, we mix it up with something non-technical, and then kind of it was a mix. Yeah, it wasn't like in the morning technical, in the afternoon all fun. I wanted to make it as light as possible.
Great. Well, it's a very admirable thing to do, Stefan. You know, not be satisfied with the current batch of conferences, so start your own. Excellent.
Yeah. But again, I failed. I failed miserably. You know,
if you're talking about the money making side of it, then you know, I guess you can't keep doing something if it's not paying its way. But I wouldn't say that you failed, because you brought a lot of information to a lot of people.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay, so that was, I just had a quick look actually while we were talking, and I saw some videos from an AMOOCon in 2009 that was there, but I thought I remembered it slightly earlier than that.
It was earlier,
yeah. And also I think I came across you when Astricon, run by Steve Sokol, came to Berlin. Is that correct, in 2006?
Maybe.
Yeah.
I remember a couple of Astricons in the US, but there was one in Berlin too. But honestly, in those days, I had, if I remember right, I had the feeling that it was kind of, they half-assed it, because Europe was not such an important market for them. At least they felt like it wasn't important. So they, the first conference in Berlin was not very interesting.
Well, I think the other issue was that first batch of conferences in Europe, and I think you'd appreciate this being a conference organizer yourself, that they put on one in Berlin, one in Paris, and one in London, all within a few days of each other. And of course, that meant there were 3 lots of conference costs. And it also meant that the audience from Europe was diluted across these 3, rather than putting them all in one place. And so I think that was another reason why they didn't necessarily repeat the exercise. But yes, I think generally speaking, when things are created in the US, sometimes there's not so much of an understanding of the markets and the potential outside of that.
No, in those days, Digium totally underestimated the whole European market, totally, and they didn't understand it. But I don't know how much that has changed. I guess I always had a good, or I always thought high about Zangoma. They always were keen for the European market, and they stuff like the first hardware card which had analog and ISDN on the same card. That was a project from Zangoma, which I was involved, because we had a customer and a big insurance company which had some 2,000 offices all over Germany, and that was my client. I created the PBX for them, or not me personally, but my company. And we needed that interface because zip was not an option in those days. I remember asking Digium if they could provide one card which has ICN and analog on the same card. And I said no. And then I met with the Zangoma guys, and I'm not sure who was at the meeting, but I remember that Dave was somehow involved and said, yeah, why not? I don't see a technical reason why we couldn't do that.
Right.
And then they started that, and then Digium came on the same. They kind of copied their idea. I still believe that Zangoma had the better hardware, but I don't know. That's all.
They seem to get things ironed out faster for ISDN 2 as well, didn't they? In terms of
but that's all water under the bridge. So it just Zangoma always was very open-minded and interested on the European market, and Digium for a very long time just wasn't. And
of course there were other players in the European market as well, weren't there? Like Jungens and Baronet and people like that doing hardware around ISDN and things. Great. Okay. Well, look, thank you for diving backwards a little bit and explaining how AMOOCon came to be there, and fun memories of that era. But you said, you had your time in telephony and you grew a little bit disillusioned with it, and it was more like the kind of issues around users than the technology itself that drove that. So bring us a bit more up to date, Stefan, and tell us what you're up to these days.
What I do these days, I still do a lot of web related stuff, and I do some audio related stuff too. I have a German podcast, a travel podcast. So a lot of the audio stuff came back via the podcast idea. And I do some training, and it's more like a mixed bag right now. Because I realized in the past that if I stick to one specific thing like PBXs, then there's a big chance of getting bored quickly. So I try to cover a couple of things, so I can change topics during the month. That makes work much easier for me. So, and I became a father, so I have 2 kids, and they take a lot of time too. So
congratulations. So these happenings in life put things in perspective for you.
You know what, I want to add something which I'm grateful to this day. I remember maybe it was the last conference you guys did in Chicago, but I don't know if it was the last one, but one of the conference in Chicago, I want to say 10 years ago, maybe 11 years ago.
Right, at ClueCon.
At ClueCon, I gave a talk, and that talk was probably on the second or on the third day. And I remember that while I was staying in Chicago, I got a call from my wife that my son became ill. And I talked to the guys who organized the conference. I'm very bad with names, so please.
Would it have been Tony or Brian?
Brian, probably Brian. Yeah, and I talked to them, and no question asked. They moved me forward to the maybe the first day or so. I don't know, at the beginning of the conference. So I was able to take the flight on the very same day in the night flight back home.
Oh, brilliant.
And having running a conference myself, I know how much work that is to move people and to ask people, etc., etc. So, and I was so grateful for that. And that's one of the very positive memories I have about the whole ClueCon crew and the team and the people. I really, I always like the people, the free switch community.
I think you've hit a certain nail on the head there, Stefan, that although we get excited about the technology sometimes, it is the people and the family side of this. And this is one of the things I noticed. And as you know, I have a very heavy involvement on the Asterisk side and with Astricon. But one of the things that always hit me about ClueCon was the family feel of ClueCon and the sense of community and the things that we did in the evening together and stuff like that. And people like Brian and Sharon and Tony and all the people, Jill and Abby, and they have that sense that they know what's most important. And that story you've just told is an example of that.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Well, that's very positive. Coming to the point of talking about what you're up to today, I wanted to ask, how does one get on in the world of travel podcasting in the current climate?
David, you're asking all the hard questions. It's not an easy time to have a travel podcast. That's not a big secret. It is a tough place to be. fortunately, I have the IT stuff, so the fridge is still fully filled. But yeah, travel podcast, that's going to be another hard year. I hope end of this year, maybe, or probably 2022 will be easier.
I'm quite interested in the fact, Stefan, that travel sort of comes back into your story, because you started off telling us that you were dealing with travel in the very beginning, and then you've done all these other things, and somehow it's kind of looped back in. Is that because it's important to you as a person?
I always have these two things, travel and IT. And to be honest, I wasted so much money on both. So it's
Is money ever wasted on travel, Stefan? Or do you mean in the business sense?
Both. It's for a long time I used travel as replacement for therapy. Because if you are young, I don't know, you traveled your fair share too, I guess. So when I was young, I traveled to see the world, and from today's perspective, I kind of wanted to make sense of everything. And then you sit somewhere on a beach in Hawaii or somewhere, and other people who have their own issues sit there together, and or everybody drinks alcohol, somebody plays the guitar, there's always the guitar player, and everybody tells meaningful stories. From today's perspective, I know all those meaningful stories they're copycats. It's all, everybody tells the same story on that beach, and it's yeah. From today I have a different perspective. I still like to travel. I'm not going to sit at the beach any longer. I'm too old for that. So I prefer a nice hotel. But the travel bug still haunts me. Now I have the excuse that I can say, okay, I want to show my kids the world. So we travel together. They are part of my podcast too. So every second episode, I try to do a podcast episode for like a family version, and I do travel features. So it's like a whole story where have the camera, and if I put, you see, I have here my good microphone. Now I'm using the lousy microphone because I wasn't able to plug it in, because technically, we are all not that, you know what I mean. And I lost my train of thought.
You were talking about having podcasts for the kids, every second one that you...
Yeah, every second one I produce a podcast with my kids, so with the whole family. For example, the last one was an episode where we went to Florida, to the Everglades, and did an airboat tour there, and that was great fun for everybody. So it's a piece of my work where I can involve my kids and become closer to them through the work, which is very interesting. I started the computers at the age of 8. My son now is 12. He does use a computer, but it's not like he has not the same, how can I put it? It's not an urge for him to program. Right. For me, that was my first computer. That was an ZX81 from Spectrum.
Remember them, Sinclair, yeah? Remember it very
Sinclair,
well.
Yeah. And that was, for me, a totally different new world. My kids grew up in a different world. It's not like, I don't know, they don't have that urge. My daughter likes to use computers a bit more than my son, but both are not into programming heavily.
I think maybe one of the differences that when computers came out in the time that you and I would remember, they weren't developed, were they? And so part of using them had to be programming them.
Yeah.
Whereas these days, they're all full of apps to do everything that everybody already needs, or connect to the internet or whatever. But I tried to encourage my son. I said, don't just use a computer, get it to do what you want it to do via programming. He never really took to it, Stefan, and to this day, he's not particularly interested. But I think part of the art of parenting is encouraging the youngsters to go in the ways that they'd like to, rather than trying to shoehorn them into what you want them to do. And just it's funny you should mention the thing in Florida with your children. Not on a podcast basis, but when my daughter was, I think 5 or 6, something like that age, she wrote a poem about waterfalls, and that inspired me to take them on a holiday to Niagara Falls to see these waterfalls. And your children do that to you, don't they? They come up with things, and it can be very inspiring indeed. Excellent. Well, it's good to know that you're able to involve your family in the things that you're up to, and that you have variety, because it sounds like you're a person that needs variety in terms of the work across the month, and so that's excellent. Just coming back to your involvement in ClueCon for a moment, Stefan, can you remember what you were talking about back in those days when you were traveling to Chicago to do ClueCons?
I kind of remember my last talk, which was about the speed of a web GUI in the PBX system. So most of PBXs today are configured with web GUIs. And I find it fascinating how the speed of a GUI changes how people use it. And most people in the software industry and in the PBX industry too don't realize it. So a lot of GUIs are very slow, specifically on the web, but also other GUIs like, I don't know, a traffic light or something, where you press a button and it takes forever to get a green. So there's all sorts of optimization there, and I find that topic very, very interesting. How you can change human behavior just by changing the speed how your software reacts. And that was my last talk. And the talks before that, I don't know. I really don't know.
It seems like you've always taken a slightly sideways view of this, Stefan, to come to these points. So that's excellent. Well, of course, we thank you very much for your involvement in ClueCon and those kind of things, and of course for giving the world a MooCon over those years when it occurred, and the contribution it made to the kind of overall development of the open source communications world. I remember lots of different people hopping over to a MooCon back in the day. And we're coming towards an end of our time of talking together, Stefan. Is there anything else you'd like to tell people while we're here?
No, but do we have a time for one question?
Yes, of course.
Tell me, what happened in the last 10 years?
What happened in terms of the development of open source communications? Or
I read that Sangoma bought Digium, but what happened else?
Yes, Sangoma bought Digium in 2018, and therefore inherited the Asterisk project. So they're now the keepers of Asterisk. And that has sort of borne various fruits over the last couple of years. On the FreeSwitch side, the team around FreeSwitch created a company called SignalWire. You can see the logo at the top of the screen. So SignalWire is now the parent company of the FreeSwitch project, and FreeSwitch continues to be a very, very healthy and vibrant open source community comms project. But SignalWire itself also has commercial products. One of them being the SignalWire Cloud offering, and that allows people to write to an API and command communications functionality in 2 different flavors. One of them is an HTTP API where you can and that actually that's interesting because it speaks directly to your point about the speed of reaction. Because, of course, commanding things via HTTP, you're kind of waiting for something to come back. Yep. Whereas the new signal wire relay API is a persistent TCP/IP connection to the infrastructure. So you tell it to do something, you get a response back immediately, and the dialogue stays open all the time. And so the idea of that was to allow people that maybe were using FreeSwitch and wanted to move from the 4 servers to the 40 servers or whatever, to actually make a transition and just write to some infrastructure which would not only be global in its deployment, but would be elastic in its reaction to requirements. So if all of a sudden you need 1,000 calls, you got them, rather than having to kind of build up your own infrastructure. So that's one of the other things that's happened.
Wow. Okay. So please say hi to Tony. I don't know if he remembers me, and Brian and everybody who does remember me. Yeah, it was great fun to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, I certainly will. I'm sure they'd pass on their good wishes to you as well. And they'll be watching this episode of ClueCon Weekly at some stage in the future.
Thank you.
Stefan, thank you very, very much for joining us. All the best to you and your family. And I hope we get to see each other again in real life at some stage. Who knows where and when and even how. But very, very grateful for your participation in this ClueCon Weekly as we bring it to an end. And so for now, Stefan Wintermeyer, thank you very much.
Bye. Tschüss.
All the best. Tschüss. Bye-bye.